4 armed men stormed the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan, demanding millions. But when their guns turned toward a quiet 15-year-old boy, everything changed. Because this wasn't just any teenager. This was someone trained to outthink generals, and what he revealed that night set off a chain of events that would shake an empire. The evening at La Renaissance began with elegance and quiet splendor. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, bathing the marble floors and silk-draped walls in warm light. Waiters glided between tables with trays of aged wine and plates of delicacies that only the city's wealthiest could afford. Conversations rose and fell in hushed tones, laughter mingling with the faint sound of a live violinist playing in the corner. Every detail of the restaurant was designed to exude wealth, refinement, and safety. But all of that changed in an instant. The heavy front doors burst open with a metallic thud, and 4 men wearing blue-gray maintenance overalls stormed inside. Their boots pounded against the floor as they pulled handguns from under their jackets. The music stopped. Conversations froze. The air grew thick with fear. One of the men kicked the door shut and jammed a steel bar through the handles, sealing everyone inside. Another pointed his weapon toward the ceiling and fired a single deafening shot. Crystal fragments rained down from the chandelier as screams erupted across the dining hall, phones on the tables. "Now!" the leader barked. His voice carried the weight of command, rough and threatening, sharpened by years of violence. Guests scrambled in terror, sliding their phones onto the linen-covered tables. Diamond bracelets rattled against glassware. A woman dropped her purse, spilling lipsticks and perfume bottles across the floor. A man tried to reach for his jacket pocket but froze when the nearest gunman swung his weapon in his direction. At the center of the chaos sat Victoria Ashford, CEO of Ashford Industries, one of the most powerful women in the country. Dressed in a sleek black evening gown, she had come here for solitude, to enjoy her favorite corner table away from the press, her board, and her enemies. But before she could even process what was happening, she felt the cold muzzle of a pistol press against her back. "Don't move," the leader whispered, leaning close enough that she felt the grit of his breath. 50 million transferred now or people start dying. Her body stiffened. Decades of boardroom battles had taught her how to mask fear, but this was different. This was life or death. Panic spread across the room like wildfire. Waiters dropped their trays and ran for cover. A young couple clutched each other under the table. An elderly man whispered a desperate prayer, his rosary beads trembling in his hands. The room smelled of gunpowder, sweat, and expensive perfume, all colliding in a haze of fear, but not everyone reacted with terror. At the next table over, a 15-year-old boy quietly chewed the last bite of his hamburger. His uniform shirt was slightly wrinkled and his backpack rested on the floor beside him, scuffed from daily use. He looked entirely out of place among the wealthy elite who filled the restaurant. Yet there he sat, calm, methodical, finishing his meal as though nothing extraordinary were happening. "Hey, kid!" one of the gunmen snapped, pointing the barrel of his pistol at him. "Phone on the table." "Are you deaf?" The boy slowly lifted his head. His name was Daniel Reeves, and his dark eyes showed not a flicker of panic. Instead, they held a calm, piercing focus, as if he had already calculated every possible outcome. "I'm listening," Daniel replied evenly, wiping his mouth with his napkin. His tone was polite, almost casual. "I was just finishing my food. My father always said wasting a meal is disrespectful." The men exchanged glances, unsettled by the boy's lack of fear. The leader stepped closer, smirking. "You think you're funny? Keep talking and you'll be the first to go." Daniel blinked once, steady as stone. His voice remained cool, almost detached. "You've got about 4 minutes and 37 seconds before the police arrive. The silent alarm went off when you forced the door." The room froze. Even Victoria, still trembling with the gun pressed to her back, turned her head slightly in shock. The leader narrowed his eyes. "How the hell do you know that?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "Observation. The manager tapped his watch 3 times when you came in. That's a panic signal. My father used to show me security manuals when I was younger. I know the signs." For a moment, silence weighed heavily in the air. The violinist's bow still hovered in midair. A woman clutched her pearls. The robbers looked at each other, uncertain whether to laugh or shoot. And still, Daniel Reeves did not flinch. The threat came sharp and sudden. The gang leader pressed his gun harder against Victoria's back, his patience cracking like glass. "Enough games," he barked. "We'll start with the kid. Maybe that'll shut everyone up." His finger twitched on the trigger. The other robbers fanned out, their boots thudding against the polished floor, weapons sweeping the trembling crowd. The violinist dropped his bow, hands raised high in surrender. A woman whimpered, clutching her child close. The scent of spilled wine mingled with fear, turning the luxurious air suffocating. But Daniel Reeves didn't hesitate. He had been waiting for this exact moment, studying their movements, their spacing, their weaknesses. Every breath, every second, every angle had already been calculated in his mind. With sudden force, he kicked his chair backward and shoved the heavy oak table up and forward. Plates of lamb and crystal glasses launched into the air. Gravy and shards of porcelain smacked against the leader's face, momentarily blinding him. The gun wavered, firing harmlessly into the ceiling. The blast shattered another chandelier, raining glass across the room. Screams erupted, but Daniel moved with surgical precision. He lunged low, scooping up a metal serving tray from the floor. In one swift motion, he swung it upward like a shield, deflecting a shot that would have torn through his chest. The bullet ricocheted into the wall, sending plaster dust into the air. The nearest robber cursed, charging forward. Daniel pivoted, yanking the fire extinguisher from its wall bracket. His hands worked quickly, pulling the pin and squeezing the handle. A jet of white foam blasted across the attacker's face, coating him in blinding mist. The man staggered, coughing and swiping at his eyes. Daniel didn't waste a second. He swung the heavy extinguisher with the precision of a hammer, striking the man's ribs. The crack of impact echoed through the dining hall. The robber collapsed with a groan, his weapon skittering across the marble floor. Another gunman advanced, snarling, raising his pistol. Daniel dropped the extinguisher and slipped into his opponent's blind side with startling speed. He hooked the man's arm, twisted it sharply until bones strained, and wrenched the gun free. Before the attacker could scream, Daniel delivered a precise elbow to the jaw. The man crumpled instantly, unconscious before his body even hit the ground. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't some reckless teenager flailing against trained criminals. This boy moved like a soldier, each strike efficient, calculated, and devastating. He wasn't surviving the attack. He was controlling it. Across the room, the leader finally wiped the food and glass from his eyes. He raised his weapon, aiming directly at Daniel's chest. For a moment, the two locked eyes, youth against seasoned killer. Daniel stood tall, calm as ever. His voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Wrong restaurant," he said evenly. Then, after a pause that carried the weight of inevitability, "And definitely the wrong kid." Before the leader could fire, a new sound filled the room. Not sirens, not shouts, but the synchronized stomp of boots. From the shadows of the back entrance emerged a group of men, silent, disciplined, their posture unmistakable. They moved with the precision of veterans, weapons raised, eyes scanning the room like hawks. Their presence radiated authority and control. The gang froze. Their bravado evaporated in an instant. These weren't frightened civilians or uniformed police who could be outgunned. These were professionals, trained men with the kind of calm that came from years of combat. The leader's hands trembled. He glanced between his cornered crew, Daniel, and the newcomers. The realization hit him too late. This wasn't a random robbery. It was a trap. A carefully orchestrated setup they had walked straight into, blind to the true danger that awaited them. Daniel bent down, calmly picking up the dropped pistol from the marble floor. He ejected the magazine, slid the weapon across the tiles toward the veterans, and dusted off his hands like he had just finished homework. Victoria, still frozen in her chair, tried to reconcile the impossible. The boy who had walked in wearing scuffed sneakers and a wrinkled shirt had just dismantled armed men in seconds. His composure, his precision, his defiance, it wasn't luck. It was training, and for the first time in years, Victoria Ashford felt something she never thought she would again. Not fear of the gun pressed to her back, not terror at the chaos, but fear of a boy whose name she barely knew. The veterans closed in, weapons steady, voices sharp and commanding. "On the ground! Now!" The remaining robbers obeyed without hesitation, their bravado shattered, their limbs trembling as they dropped their weapons and fell to their knees. Daniel stepped back, folding his arms, his expression unreadable. His part in the fight was over. The message was clear. He had drawn them in. He had ended it. And he wasn't just a bystander. He was the reason it had all unfolded this way. The chaos inside La Renaissance had begun to settle. Shattered glass crunched beneath the boots of uniformed officers as they moved through the dining hall, collecting weapons and escorting the subdued gunmen out into waiting vans. Guests whispered frantically to one another, clinging to family members, struggling to comprehend how an evening of luxury had descended into madness. Some cried openly. Others stared blankly at the wreckage, still too numb to speak. Victoria Ashford sat rigid in her chair, her designer gown flecked with dust and spilled wine. Relief should have washed over her by now, the kind of relief that followed surviving a brush with death. Yet her pulse refused to slow. Her hands remained clenched into fists in her lap, because her eyes kept straying to the boy who had turned the night upside down, Daniel Reeves. Barely 15. Skinny, with a wrinkled shirt and scuffed shoes, the kind of kid no one in this restaurant would have noticed before the attack. Yet he had moved with the confidence of a man twice his age. He had disarmed grown criminals, calculated their every move, and ended the standoff with a composure that shook her more than the muzzle of any gun. When the last robber was dragged away, Daniel stooped, lifting his battered backpack from the floor. The zipper rasped as he pulled it open. Victoria expected to see textbooks, perhaps headphones, maybe a packet of gum. What she glimpsed instead turned her blood cold. Neatly stacked inside were folders and coded notebooks. Sheets covered in diagrams and numbers, margins filled with shorthand notes only a trained mind could decipher. Beneath them, thick envelopes sealed with tape and military documents marked with stamps she recognized instantly. Confidential. Eyes only. Classified. The boy noticed her stare. Slowly, he swung the pack onto one shoulder, stepped close, and leaned toward her ear. His voice was low, quiet enough that it cut through the noise of policemen shouting orders. "After the police are done," he murmured, "we need to talk. About Defcon Industries." The name struck her like a blast of icy water. Defcon. She felt her chest tighten, though she willed her face to remain expressionless. Defcon Industries was no ordinary weapons firm. It was the cornerstone of her fortune, the engine of contracts that stretched from Washington to foreign capitals. It was tied to billion-dollar defense deals, shadow projects, and the kind of backroom negotiations that never reached the newspapers. And it was also the most dangerous word the boy could have spoken to her. Victoria turned her head slightly, her voice tense, each syllable measured. "Why bring up Defcon?" Daniel's dark eyes didn't waver. "Because my father did," the words made her stomach twist. His father. She remembered the name immediately, General Marcus Reeves. Decorated commander, investigator, a man who had spent his final years exposing corruption in military contracts. He had been relentless, digging into companies that believed themselves untouchable. And Defcon had been at the center of his last investigation until, suddenly, Marcus Reeves was gone. A heart attack, the reports had said. Natural causes. She had even sent condolences, a carefully worded statement about his dedication and service. At the funeral, she recalled a boy in a black suit, standing small beside the coffin as soldiers folded the flag. And now here that boy was, grown sharper, harder, his father's determination burning in his eyes. Daniel adjusted the strap of his backpack, his voice steady but edged with the weight of grief hardened into steel. "My father didn't die of a heart attack." He was silenced. "You know it, and I have the proof." Victoria's pulse hammered in her ears. She wanted to scoff, to dismiss him as a grieving child clinging to conspiracy. But the meticulous order of the documents, the precision of his words, the way he had orchestrated the confrontation tonight, none of it felt like fantasy. This boy wasn't speculating. He was certain. "You're walking on dangerous ground," she whispered. Daniel's gaze sharpened, unwavering. "No, I'm walking the same ground my father did." He uncovered who was stealing, who was lying, who was trading lives for profit. And when he got too close, they made sure he never spoke again. "But he left me everything. Notes, names, evidence, enough to finish what he started." The restaurant noise faded from her perception. She heard nothing but his voice and the thudding of her own heart. For decades, she had commanded power, reduced rivals to silence with money, with influence, with threats. But staring at this boy, she felt cornered in a way she hadn't since her own rise to the top. Daniel wasn't asking for money. He wasn't intimidated by her power. He wasn't afraid of her at all. He was his father's legacy, and he had come for her. The cafe was alive with noise and movement the following morning. Cups clinked against saucers, steam hissed from the espresso machine, and baristas shouted names over the din of conversation. To anyone passing by, it was just another weekday morning in Manhattan. But at the small corner table near the window, where sunlight fell in fractured patterns through the glass, two people sat across from one another, locked in a battle that could not be seen but could certainly be felt. Victoria Ashford had dressed simply, though even simplicity on her carried elegance. A tailored coat, dark sunglasses pushed back into her hair, a silk scarf tied loosely at her throat. Her poise remained intact, but inside, her nerves buzzed with unease. The billionaire who once controlled boardrooms and senators with a single phone call now found herself studying the boy across from her, trying to understand how he had forced her into this meeting. Daniel Reeves looked unremarkable to anyone else. His sneakers were scuffed, his jacket a size too big, his hair slightly mussed. A mug of hot chocolate sat in front of him, whipped cream melting slowly at the edges. He could have been any high school student waiting for a ride, finishing homework, or meeting a friend. Yet Victoria knew better. The calm in his eyes, the quiet way he stirred his drink, the deliberate silence before he spoke. All of it radiated purpose. When he finally lifted his gaze, his words came sharp, cutting through the noise of the cafe as though he had spoken directly into her chest. My father discovered who was profiting from broken equipment that cost soldiers their lives. He found the money, the bribes, even the poison in his blood. And I have all the evidence. Victoria stiffened, though she tried not to show it. She forced a small smile, attempting to brush him off like a child telling ghost stories. Conspiracy theories don't scare me, Daniel. You're young, and you've lost someone you loved. That pain can make the world look darker than it is. But Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his backpack and slid a folder across the table. The sound of it dragging over the wood seemed louder than it should have been. Victoria's fingers hesitated before she touched it. Inside were documents that turned her stomach. Autopsy results that contradicted the official report. Lab analysis of toxins that should never have been in Marcus Reeves's system. Financial records mapping the flow of money from shell companies to offshore accounts. Photographs and recordings. Voices she recognized. Voices of men she had worked with, trusted, even manipulated, discussing payments and cover-ups. The color drained from her face. For the first time in years, she felt something close to vertigo. Her empire, so carefully built over decades, suddenly looked fragile, as though one hard push could send it crashing into ruin. Her throat tightened. What do you want? The words came out quieter than she intended, edged with a tremor she could not conceal. Daniel leaned back, calm, almost casual, though his words carried the weight of steel. Not money, justice. You'll transfer your controlling shares of Defcon to veterans' families. You'll resign publicly, admitting your role, and you'll face what you've done. Or, he tapped the folder with one finger. The world learns everything tomorrow morning. Victoria's breath caught. The boy across from her was not bargaining. He was dictating terms. You're asking me to destroy myself, she said, her voice hoarse. No, Daniel corrected, his gaze unyielding. I'm asking you to stop pretending you haven't already destroyed yourself. This is about the people who died because of your greed. Soldiers who trusted your company's equipment. Families who buried them because contracts were padded, parts were faulty, and bribes kept it all hidden. Her hands trembled as she clutched her coffee cup, though the liquid inside had gone cold. She tried to summon her old instincts, the ability to intimidate, to manipulate, to turn the tables on anyone who dared challenge her. But against Daniel, nothing worked. His strength didn't come from money or influence. It came from truth, from evidence, from the raw determination of a son who had lost everything and refused to let his father's death be in vain. For the first time, Victoria understood the scale of the threat. This wasn't a scandal she could buy her way out of, or a critic she could silence with lawsuits. This was a reckoning. The boy in front of her had already won the first battle. The only question now was how much of her empire she would lose, and whether she would survive the storm that was about to come. Daniel raised his mug of hot chocolate, took a sip, and set it down again. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of finality. The choice is yours. But remember, my father always said truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury it, and I intend to make sure it does. Victoria's eyes burned, not with anger, but with something far rarer, fear. And across the table, Daniel Reeves simply waited, silent and steady, like a judge already certain of the verdict. Victoria Ashford had once believed herself untouchable. Her empire stretched across continents, her reach woven into governments, militaries, and markets. A single phone call from her could sway senators, erase competitors, and silence critics. But within 24 hours, all of that collapsed, crumbling faster than she could have imagined. It began with the headlines. At first, she thought she could contain them. A leaked report here, a suspicious blog post there, surely her media teams could bury it. Yet this time the stories spread like wildfire, picked up by journalists she once controlled, amplified by networks she had financed, and echoed on social platforms by millions who relished the downfall of a billionaire. Every secret she had buried, every deal she had struck, Every death she had quietly profited from, laid bare before the world. Her phone rang endlessly that day, though fewer and fewer allies bothered to answer when she called. Those who did spoke in clipped, hurried tones, distancing themselves, advising her to handle things quietly or consider early retirement. But there was no escape. The documents Daniel had released were undeniable. Bank records, contracts, recordings, even videos of boardroom discussions where profits were weighed against the lives of soldiers. She had no shield left to hide behind. Desperation drove her to fight back. She unleashed her public relations machine, spinning stories that Daniel was a troubled teenager, unbalanced and dangerous. She hired investigators to dig into his past, hackers to sabotage his communications, lawyers to issue threats of defamation. But each move she made was countered, anticipated, dismantled, before it could land a blow. Daniel was always ahead of her. What she hadn't understood was that he wasn't fighting alone. Behind him stood men and women who had once served under his father, veterans who carried loyalty in their bones, who had waited years for someone brave enough to finish what General Marcus Reeves had started. And beside them stood journalists, hardened truth-seekers who had been waiting for a chance to expose the corruption they had long suspected but could never prove. Together they became an unbreakable wall, shielding Daniel while amplifying his voice. By nightfall, Victoria's name was trending worldwide, not as a titan of industry, but as a symbol of greed, betrayal, and bloodstained profit. Stockholders fled. Banks froze her accounts. Politicians she had bankrolled for decades issued public statements denouncing her. Her once loyal executives scrambled to save themselves, testifying against her before they too could be implicated. The fortune she had built across a lifetime dissolved in hours. The private jets, the mansions, the art collections, even the silent respect she commanded in every room, all gone. She was left not as a queen of finance, but as a criminal awaiting trial. Her legacy rewritten as cautionary tale, and while her world imploded, Daniel began to build something new from the ashes. He was just 16, but in him burned the clarity and resolve of someone who had been forced to grow up too fast. With quiet determination, he established the Daniel Reeves Fund, named for the man who had taught him discipline, honor, and the price of loyalty. The fund was not for show, not for politics, but for the people his father had sworn to protect. Veterans struggling to rebuild their lives, families left behind when soldiers never returned, children who had lost parents in wars they couldn't understand. The first transfers came from assets seized from Victoria's accounts, millions funneled into programs for healthcare, education, and housing. Within weeks, soldiers who had once been statistics on casualty lists now had lifelines. For every dollar Victoria had stolen, Daniel made sure it was returned tenfold in service to those she had betrayed. One evening, as autumn leaves drifted across the cemetery, Daniel stood before his father's grave. The sun was sinking, painting the horizon in amber and gold. He carried a small bouquet of white lilies, simple and unadorned. Kneeling, he placed them gently against the headstone etched with the name General Marcus Reeves. His voice was quiet but steady, carried by the evening wind. "We won, Dad. They thought killing you would end it. But you prepared me for this moment. Every lesson, every word, you were getting me ready, weren't you?" He let the silence linger, the weight of memory pressing against his chest. His father's absence was a wound that never fully closed, but now it carried purpose, not just pain. Daniel straightened, eyes clear, shoulders squared with the same quiet authority his father had once commanded. They thought power was measured in money, influence, fear. But you taught me different. True power isn't in wealth. It's in integrity, in loyalty, in having a plan that outlives you. As he turned to leave, the boy who had once seemed ordinary walked with the bearing of a leader. The world had tried to break him, but instead, it had forged him into something far greater. A son carrying forward his father's mission. A young man proving that even in an age ruled by money, there was still room for justice. And behind him, the flowers swayed gently in the breeze, a quiet promise kept. If you think Daniel's story ended here, you're wrong. Because this was only the first battle in a war that reaches the highest levels of power. Subscribe now, because the truth about what comes next will shock you even more than this.